The question of whether the Necrons could be considered the first humans is one that might initially sound absurd given the mechanical horrors they have become. After all, these are beings who have long abandoned their flesh in favor of cold, unfeeling metal bodies, and they now exist as an ancient and powerful race of soulless beings. However, if we dig deeper into their origins, the lines between what constitutes human and alien become a lot blurrier. The Necrons in their earliest days were not always the terrifying skeletal machines we know today. Before they were bound by the curse of biotransference, they were a race of powerful, living beings, a species that once walked the stars, just like humanity would millennia later. But what if there's more to this connection than mere coincidence? Could there be a shared history between the Necrons and humanity? Was there a time when the Necrons were more like us than we ever realized? This is the question that we'll explore today. While the Necrons themselves may have shed their humanity in a horrific transformation, the truth is that they may have once been very much like us, existing on a similar evolutionary path. The story of the Necrons begins long before the dark age of the 40K universe, and in their origins lies a fascinating connection to the dawn of humanity, a connection that raises more questions than it answers. As we venture into the depths of the Necrons' past, we'll uncover secrets that challenge our assumptions about this ancient race. Were they truly the first humans, or is there something even deeper buried within their history? Stay with me as we unravel the mystery of the Necrons and their strange, possibly shared fate with humanity. Long before they became the terrifying metallic beings known as the Necrons, this ancient race was once known as the Necrontyr. They were a species living on a dying world under the crushing weight of a hostile sun, their planet plagued by radiation and extreme environmental conditions that made survival a constant struggle. The Necrontyr were a proud people, one that constantly sought answers to the great mysteries of the universe, driven by an insatiable curiosity about life and death. But despite their intelligence, they were deeply frail, their bodies short-lived and weak. They lived with the knowledge that their lifespan was fleeting, constantly battling the ravages of their environment and the inevitability of their demise. This bitter reality shaped their culture and their worldview. The Necrontyr were far from the cold, emotionless entities they would later become. In their early days, they were ambitious, passionate, and deeply concerned with matters of life, death, and immortality. In many ways, they were like us, like humanity in its early stages, driven by the same impulses that pushed us toward greatness. They had their own civilizations, built cities, and even had their own understanding of the cosmos. In fact, they were highly advanced, with technology far beyond what humanity could have imagined in its earliest days. Their scientific achievements were remarkable, and they had already begun to chart the stars and build wonders of technology that spoke to a people capable of creating great empires. However, their advancements could not protect them from the greatest of all fears: death. The Necrontyr's obsession with immortality was not just a passing phase. It was a fundamental part of their identity. They sought ways to cheat death, to find a way to survive in a universe that seemed bent on destroying them. This obsession would eventually lead them down a path of no return, one that would cost them their humanity, both literally and figuratively. But what were they like before all of that? Were they so different from us? Were they, in some ways, the first humans to walk the stars, only to be consumed by their own desire for eternal life? Some fan theories suggest that the Necrontyr's obsession with immortality could be viewed as a tragic reflection of humanity's own desire to overcome mortality. There are parallels to be drawn between their society and our own, particularly in our current age of technological advancements and scientific pursuits to extend life. The Necrontyr's quest for immortality, driven by their fear of death, mirrors the very essence of what makes us human. Their ambition was fueled by the same desires that push humans to explore the unknown, to conquer new frontiers, and to challenge the boundaries of what is possible. But unlike humanity, whose quest for knowledge still holds the possibility of balance and hope, the Necrontyr's pursuit was unrelenting, consuming them in ways that would leave them as little more than hollow shells of their former selves. Before the biotransference, the Necrontyr were also a deeply spiritual people, much like the early human civilizations that sought meaning in the unknown. They had gods, beliefs, and a culture rooted in a connection to something greater than themselves. Their pantheon of gods, the Citan, were an essential part of their existence, and their relationship with these entities was a complex and fraught one. They revered the Citan, believing them to be divine beings with godlike powers, and sought their guidance in matters of both life and death. But as the Necrontyr's desperation grew, so too did their willingness to sacrifice everything, even their very souls, in exchange for the promise of eternal life. This willingness to sacrifice all for the sake of survival and immortality became a central theme in their story, and one that would forever alter the course of their civilization. In the grand scheme of things, it's easy to see how the Necrontyr might have been a reflection of humanity's own path. We too are a species that constantly seeks answers to the mysteries of existence, driven by a fear of our own mortality and a desire to overcome it. The Necrontyr story serves as a cautionary tale, a warning of what can happen when the desire for immortality becomes all-consuming, when the pursuit of eternal life leads us to abandon everything that once made us human. Theirs is a story of ambition, tragedy, and the ultimate price paid for immortality. And in many ways, it's a story that mirrors our own. It's worth considering whether, before their transformation, the Necrontyr could have been a precursor to humanity. They were not so unlike us, and their rise to power in the galaxy could be seen as a reflection of humanity's own potential. They were a species that looked toward the stars, that sought to understand the universe, and that was driven by an innate curiosity about life itself. In their early days, they were much like us in their quest for knowledge, their desire to expand beyond the confines of their homeworld, and their belief in something greater than themselves. Their eventual fall, however, serves as a grim reminder of what can happen when ambition and fear collide. There are, of course, many who argue that the Necrontyr were never truly like humans, that they were always destined to be different. The transformation they underwent into the Necrons, after all, stripped away all that was once human about them. Their once vibrant culture was replaced by cold, mechanical efficiency, and their bodies were transformed into nothing more than mindless, soulless machines. But in the early days of their civilization, before their tragic fall, there was a spark of humanity within them, an ambition, a drive, a desire to overcome the odds. That spark may have been snuffed out in the end, but it's important to remember that the Necrontyr were once like us in some ways. Their story is a reminder that, no matter how far we evolve, the fears and desires that define us as humans are universal. As we explore their origins further, we begin to see the deeper connection between the Necrons and humanity. In their early years, they were more like us than we often care to admit. Their rise, their fall, and their ultimate transformation into the Necrons is a tragic tale of ambition, fear, and the consequences of chasing immortality. It's a story that echoes humanity's own journey, reminding us that our greatest strengths and weaknesses may be far more similar than we realize. The War in Heaven is one of the most defining events in the history of the 40K universe, a cataclysmic conflict that shaped the very fabric of reality itself. It was a war that pitted the ancient Necrontyr, who would eventually become the Necrons, against the mighty Old Ones, a race of highly advanced beings who had mastered the forces of the universe. The Necrontyr, in their desperation and fear of mortality, saw the Old Ones as their key to immortality, And this war marked the beginning of their fall from a once proud and ambitious species into the soulless, mechanical horrors we know today. But was their rise during this period purely independent, or could there have been a deeper connection to humanity? Could they have been the first precursors to what humanity would become, or were they entirely different, destined to become something else entirely? The war in heaven was fought over the very essence of life itself. The Old Ones, with their mastery over biology and the warp, had created a galaxy filled with life, shaping races, planets, and even the very stars themselves to their will. But it was this very control that led to their downfall. The Necrontyr, with their unquenchable thirst for immortality, made a pact with the Citan, ancient star gods of unfathomable power. This alliance gave them the strength they needed to challenge the Old Ones, but it came at a terrible price. In their quest for eternal life, the Necrontyr underwent a transformation, a process known as biotransference, which stripped them of their original flesh and turned them into the mechanical, soulless beings we now recognize as Necrons. The transformation was devastating, not just physically, but spiritually. The Necrons lost everything, everything that made them who they were, everything that connected them to their humanity. In the early stages of the war in heaven, the Necrons were not yet the cold, calculating machines they would become. They were still a species driven by emotion, ambition, and the desire to conquer death. Some fans believe that in these early days, the Necrontyr might have been more similar to humanity than we realize. Their desire for immortality, their technological advancements, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for survival, all of these qualities mirror humanity's own ambitions. At the heart of the war in heaven was a desperate struggle for survival, a battle to escape the crushing grip of mortality. In many ways, this struggle is not so different from the challenges humanity faces today. We too are obsessed with defying death, with seeking immortality through technology and science, and the Necrontyr's story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lie in pursuing that goal without regard for the consequences. The war itself was brutal, a war of annihilation fought between two races that were not so different from one another, yet entirely opposed in their goals. The Old Ones were focused on the preservation and advancement of life, while the Necrontyr, under the sway of the Citan, sought to destroy and rebuild everything in their image. It was a war that stretched across the stars, a war that would see entire civilizations wiped from existence and entire planets reduced to rubble. The Necrons, armed with the power of the Citan, became an unstoppable force. They were a race driven by a singular purpose, to achieve immortality at any cost. The Old Ones, with their own mastery over life, fought back fiercely, but ultimately, they were overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Necron onslaught. As the war raged on, the Necrons' connection to their humanity became increasingly tenuous. Their transformation into the soulless machines that would come to define their race was inevitable, and as they lost their physical bodies, they also lost something far more important, what made them who they were. The Citan, for all their power, were not kind masters, and the Necrons paid a terrible price for their alliance with these star gods. It's often said that the Necrons' fall into their current, undead-like state was the result of their willingness to sacrifice everything in the name of immortality. But could it have been that, in the war in heaven, they were still fighting for something that, in the end, was not so different from the desires that drive humanity? The idea that the Necrons' rise in the war in heaven could have some connection to humanity is an intriguing one. Some fans speculate that the Necrons, in their early days, might have shared some of the same qualities that made humanity such a remarkable species. The Necrons were driven by the same basic instincts that drive us: survival, ambition, and the desire to escape death. The difference, of course, is that the Necrons' solution to the problem of mortality was far more extreme than anything humanity would ever consider. They sought not just immortality, but a complete transformation, a removal of their very souls in exchange for eternal life in mechanical bodies. Humanity, for all its flaws, has always retained a connection to its soul, its essence, and it's that essence that makes us human. The Necrons, however, lost that essence in their pursuit of immortality. This connection to humanity, however faint, is something that remains a point of fascination for fans of the 40K universe. Could the Necrons have been the first humans? Could they have been a precursor to the human race, an ancient civilization that once walked the stars but was ultimately undone by its own ambition? It's a theory that has captivated many, and while the Necrons may have ultimately diverged from humanity in horrific ways, the possibility that they were once like us remains an intriguing one. Perhaps in the early days of the war in heaven, when they were still fighting for survival, they were not so different from humanity's own struggles against death and the unknown. As the war came to a close and the Necrons emerged victorious, their transformation into their current form was complete. The Old Ones were defeated, and the Necrons had achieved their goal of immortality. But at what cost? In their quest to conquer death, they had become something far worse than what they had been before, something cold, emotionless, and devoid of all the things that made them who they were. In the end, the war in heaven was not just a war for survival, but a war for their very souls. And in losing their souls, the Necrons lost their connection to their humanity, forever changing the course of their existence. The war in heaven remains a pivotal moment in the 40K universe, and the Necrons' role in it is a testament to their ambition, their drive, and their ultimate fall. Could their rise have been connected to humanity in some way? It's a question that continues to provoke debate among fans, as the Necrons' tragic journey serves as a warning of the dangers of seeking immortality at any cost. Their story is one of loss, ambition, and the ultimate price paid for the pursuit of eternal life. A price that left them as something far removed from what they once were. The biotransference process, the key turning point in the Necrons' transformation from living beings into the cold, mechanical horrors we know today, is a concept that carries with it both tragedy and dark fascination. It wasn't just a simple exchange of flesh for metal. It was an act of profound, irreversible change that fundamentally altered the Necrons. In their desperate pursuit of immortality, they sought a way to transcend the limitations of their frail, short-lived bodies. They didn't just want to extend their lives, they wanted to completely escape death. And the cost of this was their very humanity. Before biotransference, the Necrons were still Necrontyr, a race of living, breathing beings. They were driven by all the same hopes, fears, and desires as any other sentient species. They had passions, ambitions, and a deep yearning to conquer the one thing that every living being fears: mortality. Their society, once full of life and potential, was filled with the same aspirations that can be found in human civilizations. They created art, studied the stars, and dreamed of eternal glory. But their physical bodies were fragile, cursed to die young, to wither away in a hostile environment. And so they turned to the stars, searching for a way to cheat death. When they made their pact with the Cetan, the star gods that offered them the power they so desperately sought, the Necrontyr unknowingly set themselves on a path that would lead them to abandon everything that made them who they were. The biotransference process was not just a transfer of consciousness. It was a brutal, irreversible procedure that destroyed their bodies, replacing their organic material with cold, unfeeling metal. In doing so, they sealed their fate and began their descent into becoming something far more horrifying than they ever imagined. The process itself was an extreme one. Their bodies, once delicate and human-like, were broken down and remade into towering forms of living metal. But the true horror of biotransference wasn't in the physical change. It was in the loss of the very essence of who they were. The Necrons shed their flesh, their emotions, their memories, and perhaps most tragically, their souls. Some fans speculate that, at least in the early stages, the Necrons might have retained fragments of their former selves. Perhaps there was still a trace of the Necrontyr that lingered in their mechanical forms, but the further they descended into their new existence, the more the connection to their original identities faded. Was there any human connection left in the Necrons after biotransference? The answer, according to most lore, is no. They were no longer the Necrontyr, the beings who had once walked the stars with ambition and hope. In becoming the Necrons, they lost all that was human about them. The process of biotransference not only stripped them of their flesh, but it also stripped them of their very essence, leaving behind only an empty shell. The Necrons became creatures driven only by their need to destroy, conquer, and maintain the immortality they had gained at such a terrible cost. In many ways, biotransference was their undoing, turning them from a race filled with potential into soulless machines, slaves to their own desire for eternal life. However, there are some fans who argue that the Necrons' transformation was not so complete. They speculate that, deep within the minds of the Necrons, there could still be a flicker of their old selves. It's a romantic, almost tragic theory, that the Necrons are not just mindless automatons, but beings who are locked in a state of perpetual torment, forever trapped in bodies that no longer reflect who they once were. Some even suggest that the Necron Lords, those ancient leaders who once ruled their people with great ambition, may retain traces of their former personalities, their memories still intact within their mechanical forms. The possibility that they might still hold on to a piece of their humanity, even after everything they've been through, is a haunting thought. But these theories are often seen as hopeful fantasies rather than established fact. The overwhelming consensus within the lore is that the Necrons lost everything in the process of biotransference. They became utterly alien to their former selves, driven by cold logic and a singular focus on their own immortality. They no longer possessed the emotions or desires that once made them Necrontyr, and this is reflected in their culture, their society, and their behavior. The Necrons are not the tragic remnants of a fallen people. They are a new species entirely, one that has transcended death at the cost of all that was once familiar. There is also the question of whether the Necrons could have ever retained any form of humanity after biotransference. Some fans argue that the Necrons were never truly human to begin with. After all, even before the biotransference, the Necrontyr were radically different from humanity in many ways. They had their own culture, their own beliefs, and their own understanding of the universe. While they shared some basic characteristics with humanity, their evolution was shaped by their own unique circumstances. The Necrons' fall into mechanical bodies might have been extreme, but it was the inevitable outcome of their search for immortality. One of the more interesting aspects of this transformation is the question of the Necron consciousness. While their bodies were transformed into cold, unfeeling machines, their minds remained intact, at least in some form. The Necrons retained their intelligence and their strategic minds, but they lost the warmth and empathy that once came with being a living, breathing species. They became like the machines they had sought to create, perfect in function but hollow and empty on the inside. The result was a species that could no longer relate to other races in any meaningful way. They became distant, calculating, and utterly ruthless. The loss of humanity is what makes the Necrons so terrifying. It's not just that they are an ancient, powerful race. They are a race that has completely abandoned their humanity in their quest for immortality. In their cold, mechanical forms, they represent the ultimate consequence of sacrificing everything for the sake of survival. They are a warning, not just to the galaxy's other races, but to humanity itself. The Necrons show us what happens when the pursuit of eternal life becomes all-consuming, when the desire for immortality drives us to shed everything that makes us human. In the end, The Necrons are a tragic reminder of the dangers of overreaching, of striving for something beyond what nature intended. They sought to escape death, to transcend the limits of their bodies, but in doing so they lost everything that made them who they were. The Necrons are not a race of survivors, not in the traditional sense. They are a race of husks, forever trapped in the bodies they created, cursed by their own ambition. Their story is one of loss, loss of self, loss of humanity, and the loss of everything that once made them a people worthy of the stars. When we think of the Necron Lords, we often picture cold, calculating rulers of a vast empire, their minds focused solely on conquest and the preservation of their immortality. But are these Necron Lords simply mechanical overlords with no trace of the beings they once were, or is there a more nuanced side to their leadership? Were they once like the great human rulers and conquerors who carved their names into history with vision and ambition? Or have they evolved into something far more alien, beings entirely removed from the human experience? The Necron Lords, before their transformation, were not always the soulless entities we know them as today. They were once leaders among their people, powerful figures within the Necrontyr civilization, each one vying for supremacy in a society where ambition and survival went hand in hand. In many ways, they resembled the powerful leaders of any great civilization, ambitious, strategic, and driven by a desire to leave a legacy that would endure for eternity. They were not unlike the early human kings, generals, and emperors who sought dominion over the stars and the people within them. Their rise to power was not solely the result of their transformation into Necron Lords, but rather it was rooted in the same qualities that made their species great to begin with: intelligence, drive, and the ability to inspire loyalty and fear. In the early days of the Necrontyr, their leaders were not just figureheads, but truly powerful individuals who guided their people through the harsh realities of their dying world. The Necron Lords were the masterminds of their civilization, the ones who forged alliances, planned conquests, and led their people to achieve greatness. But after the biotransference and the subsequent rise to power under the Citan, the Necron Lords underwent a transformation as well. Their bodies, once similar to those of their people, became towering figures of living metal, their minds now merged with the cold logic of the machines they inhabited. While many fans argue that the Necron Lords lost any semblance of humanity after their transformation, others believe that some aspects of their leadership remained the same. There are those who think that the Necron Lords retained the traits that made them great leaders in the first place: the ability to inspire fear, command loyalty, and shape the fate of entire galaxies. In fact, the way in which the Necron Lords govern is not so dissimilar to the way human rulers throughout history have governed. They are strategic, patient, and relentless in their pursuit of dominance. They don't simply rely on raw power or brute force. Much like the great military minds of human history, the Necron Lords understand the value of tactics, of playing the long game. They are visionaries in their own right, capable of seeing the bigger picture and understanding the intricacies of war, politics, and survival. Yet, as much as the Necron Lords resemble the powerful figures of human history, they are undeniably different. Their rise to power was not achieved through diplomacy or negotiation, but rather through the dark power of the Citan and the brutal transformation that made them into the mechanical overlords they are today. Unlike human leaders who often rely on charisma, diplomacy, or the strength of their character, the Necron Lords rule through fear and unwavering authority. Their subjects are not bound to them by loyalty or love, but rather by the sheer terror of their power. There's no sense of benevolence or compassion in their leadership, only cold, efficient rule. What makes the Necron Lords so fascinating is that, despite the overwhelming evidence of their alien nature, there remains a part of them that is not entirely unlike the great rulers of human civilization. Their thirst for power, Their desire to leave a lasting legacy and their unrelenting pursuit of immortality mirror the same impulses that have driven humans to greatness. But while human leaders often leave behind works of art, culture, or philosophy, the Necron Lords have nothing but destruction, conquest, and cold, lifeless monuments to their reign. They are a tragic reflection of what could happen when the pursuit of immortality becomes all-consuming, when the desire to be remembered throughout the ages blinds one to the true cost of such ambition. In examining the Necron Lords' leadership, we can draw parallels to the concept of the fallen hero in human history. Many great leaders throughout time have started with noble goals, conquering new lands, creating great civilizations, and securing their people's future. But over time, the weight of their ambition, the corruption of power, and the relentless pursuit of immortality often lead them astray. The Necron Lords, in this sense, are a reflection of this tragic arc. They once sought to protect their people and secure their legacy, but in the end they became something else entirely. Beings consumed by their own need for power and immortality, ultimately sacrificing everything that made them Necrontyr in the first place. The question remains, did the Necron Lords ever truly lose their connection to their human-like origins? Did the process of biotransference sever all ties to their former selves, or did some part of their leadership survive the transformation? Some fans argue that the Necron Lords are the ultimate example of what happens when ambition is taken to its extreme. They believe that, in their quest for power and immortality, the Necron Lords lost all humanity, becoming cold, calculating entities who see everything and everyone as tools to be used and discarded. This interpretation suggests that the Necron Lords are as alien as they come, their leadership driven not by the desire to protect or guide their people, but by a deep, unshakable need for control and dominance. Others, however, argue that the Necron Lords are still capable of some measure of the qualities that once made them great leaders. Even in their transformed state, they remain rulers, strategic, calculating, and highly effective in their role. They still possess the intellect and cunning that once made them the driving forces behind the Necrontyr's rise to power. Their leadership is still shaped by the same instincts that guided their actions before the biotransference. A desire to leave a mark on the galaxy, to secure their place in history, and to control the destiny of their people. The debate over whether the Necron Lords retain any trace of their former humanity is a fascinating one. It's clear that their leadership is radically different from the human model of leadership, but it's also true that there are elements of their rule that echo the great leaders of history. They are not simply mindless machines. They are beings of immense intellect and power, driven by an insatiable desire to rule. Whether or not their leadership retains any of the qualities that made them human is a question that will likely remain unanswered. But it is a question worth pondering as we continue to explore the enigmatic and terrifying nature of the Necron Lords. Before the Necrons became the hollow metallic husks we know today, their culture and society were vastly different. The Necrontyr, as they were once known, lived in a harsh, unforgiving world, struggling to survive under the oppressive rays of a dying star. But despite the bleakness of their existence, the Necrontyr were a people who valued knowledge, ambition, and the pursuit of immortality. They had a complex and highly organized society, one that shared many similarities with early human civilizations, particularly in their pursuit of greatness and their desire to transcend the limits of mortality. The Necrontyr were a society driven by a fierce will to survive. Their homeworld, a planet ravaged by intense radiation and a harsh climate, forced them to become resourceful and inventive. They were a people who knew their time was limited, that their frail bodies would not endure the harsh conditions of their world. This understanding of their own mortality gave rise to a society built around the desire to overcome death. Their culture, much like early human societies, was rooted in a deep respect for life, even though that respect was often twisted by their obsession with immortality. At the core of the Necrontyr society was their obsession with death and the fear of their own mortality. This fear drove them to develop technologies and philosophies that sought to transcend the limitations of their physical forms. In many ways, their culture mirrored that of early human civilizations, which often sought to conquer death through religion, art, and monumental architecture. The Necrontyr, however, took this obsession to a darker extreme. They didn't just want to extend their lives, they wanted to eliminate death entirely. The result was a society consumed by the desire for immortality, one that would eventually lead them down the path of biotransference and the creation of the Necron race. One of the key elements of Necrontyr society was their belief system, which was deeply intertwined with their relationship to the stars and the forces of the universe. The Necrontyr worshipped the stars, believing them to be the key to their survival. They had a complex pantheon of gods, with the Citan being the most powerful and influential of these deities. The Necrontyr's relationship with the Citan was not one of reverence or worship in the traditional sense. Rather, they viewed the Citan as powerful beings that could grant them the immortality they so desperately sought. This relationship, however, was not without its dark side. The Necrontyr's alliance with the Citan would eventually lead to their downfall, as the star gods tricked them into undergoing the horrific process of biotransference. Despite the Necrontyr's eventual transformation into the Necrons, some aspects of their culture remained intact in a twisted form. The desire for power, the need for conquest, and the obsession with immortality all continued to shape Necron society, even after the biotransference had stripped them of their humanity. The Necron Lords, the ruling elite of the Necron race, continued to govern their people with a cold, calculating logic that mirrored the ambition and ruthlessness of their Necrontyr predecessors. But while the Necrons retained their intelligence and strategic prowess, the warmth and compassion that once defined their society were gone, replaced by a brutal, unfeeling need to conquer and destroy. In the early days of their society, the Necrontyr were not unlike humans in many ways. They had a rich cultural heritage, one that was defined by their pursuit of knowledge and their drive to understand the universe. They built great cities and monuments, just as early human civilizations did, and they developed complex systems of governance and social hierarchy. Like humanity, they were not content to simply exist. They sought to shape their own destiny, to leave a lasting legacy that would endure long after they were gone. This desire to achieve greatness, to transcend their limitations, was at the heart of Necrontyr society and would eventually lead them down the path to becoming the Necrons. But there were differences too. While early human civilizations were often defined by their connection to nature and the world around them, the Necrontyr were consumed by their fear of death and their obsession with escaping it. Their culture was not built around the appreciation of life, but rather around the rejection of it. The Necrontyr saw their frailty as a weakness to be overcome, and they sought to eliminate the very concept of mortality from their society. This desire for immortality led them to make terrible sacrifices, including their own souls, in their quest to achieve eternal life. Some fans believe that the Necrontyr's cultural obsession with immortality was a reflection of humanity's own fears and desires. There's a certain parallel between the Necrontyr's quest for eternal life and humanity's own obsession with defeating death. Whether through medicine, science, or technology, many of us are driven by the desire to extend our lives, to push back the inevitable march of time. The Necrontyr's downfall serves as a cautionary tale, a warning of what can happen when that desire becomes all-consuming. Their culture, while deeply advanced, was ultimately undone by their inability to accept death and their willingness to sacrifice everything, including their humanity, in the name of survival. It's also worth noting that even after the biotransference, the Necrons retained elements of their old culture. The Necron Lords, for example, continue to rule with a sense of absolute authority, mirroring the hierarchical structure of Necrontyr society. The Necrons' military might, their vast legions, and their relentless pursuit of domination all hark back to the same traits that defined their ancestors. Even though the Necrons have become something completely different, their cultural legacy lives on in their unyielding quest for power and control. The Necrons, in a way, are a tragic reflection of what could happen if humanity were to lose sight of the importance of balance. Their culture, once vibrant and full of potential, was consumed by their obsession with immortality. In their pursuit of eternal life, they abandoned everything that made them human, becoming something far worse than they could have ever imagined. Their story is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the price we pay for refusing to accept our own mortality. And while the Necrons may be far removed from humanity in their current form, there are still elements of their culture that resonate with us, elements of ambition, power, and a desire to leave a lasting legacy. The Necrons' culture, in its own twisted way, mirrors the path humanity could take if we allow our fear of death to drive us too far. The technological advancements of the Necrons are nothing short of legendary, their machines standing as testaments to a civilization that surpassed the limits of the organic and embraced the cold, calculating logic of the mechanical. But as we examine the way the Necrons developed their technology, we must ask ourselves, did they create machines in a manner similar to humanity's own rise in technology, or was their approach fundamentally alien? The Necrons, after all, were a race with a singular obsession: immortality. Their technological advancements, though undeniably impressive, were not simply about conquering the stars or advancing in the way that humanity did. They were about transcending the limitations of life and death itself. In many ways, the Necron approach to technology is profoundly different from the human experience. Humanity's rise in technology has always been rooted in the desire to improve the quality of life, to solve problems and create new possibilities. Our technological advancements, while often driven by war and survival, have ultimately been about creating a better future. We build machines to ease our burdens, enhance our abilities, and extend our lives. For the Necrons, however, technology was never about improving the human condition. It was about escaping death. Their machines were not designed to enrich life, but to preserve it, to freeze it in time, and to ultimately conquer mortality. At the heart of Necron technology is the concept of biomancy, the manipulation of life itself. This is a deeply alien aspect of their technological development. While humanity's advancements in science and technology have primarily focused on harnessing the natural world around us through physics, biology, and chemistry, the Necrons' mastery of biomancy meant they could manipulate the very fabric of life. The Necrons' machines were not just mechanical, they were alive, imbued with the essence of the Citan and the twisted remnants of the Necrontyr's desire to transcend the flesh. Their technology was not about convenience or progress. It was about survival at any cost, even if that meant sacrificing everything that made them human. This obsession with immortality is perhaps best exemplified in the Necrons' most infamous creation, the Tomb Worlds. These enormous planetary-scale constructs were designed to preserve the Necrons in stasis, waiting for the moment when they could rise again and reclaim the galaxy. The tombs were not simply advanced technology, they were monuments to the Necrons' desire to escape the passage of time itself. These tombs housed entire armies, frozen in time, their machines and bodies preserved until the day they would once again awaken to wage war. In this way, the Necrons' technology was not just a tool for conquest. It was a means of ensuring their eternal survival, even if that survival meant losing everything else in the process. The creation of the Necron machines, like their bodies, was a direct result of their transformation during biotransference. This was not a natural evolution of their technological prowess, but a dark bargain with the Citan, the star gods who granted the Necrons their immortality. The Necrons' machines were infused with the power of the Citan, their energy harnessed to power the vast cold constructs that now dominate the galaxy. These machines, from the simplest Necron warriors to the towering, monstrous constructs like the Doom Scythes and the Triarch Stalkers, were not built with the intention of improving life. They were built to destroy, to conquer, and to perpetuate the endless cycle of their own existence. Unlike humanity, whose technological rise has been driven by a combination of creativity, necessity, and the desire to understand the world around us, the Necrons' creations were purely utilitarian. Their machines were designed for a singular purpose, to serve the Necron Lords and their unyielding pursuit of immortality. There was no room for creativity or experimentation in their technological advancements. Every machine, every weapon, every vehicle was created with the sole intent of furthering the Necrons' reign. It was a society entirely devoted to the singular goal of survival and domination, with no room for the ethical considerations that have often guided humanity's own progress. This cold, pragmatic approach to technology has led to some fascinating discussions among fans. Some speculate that the Necrons' machines are, in a way, a reflection of their loss of humanity. Their technology is a symbol of their transformation into something entirely different, a species that no longer values life, but instead seeks only to preserve itself through mechanical perfection. Their machines are not the products of a race driven by hope, ambition, or creativity, but the tools of a civilization that has abandoned its soul in the name of immortality. In this way, the Necrons' technology can be seen as a grim reminder of the cost of their pursuit of eternal life, a reminder that, in their quest to escape death, they lost everything that made them truly alive. Others, however, argue that the Necrons' technology is a natural extension of their desires. In their eyes, the Necrons' creations represent the ultimate triumph over mortality. Their machines are perfect, unyielding, and eternal, everything the Necrons themselves sought to become. The fact that these machines continue to function, even millennia after their creators fall from grace, speaks to the Necrons' sheer technological genius. While the machines themselves may be cold and lifeless, they are also the embodiment of the Necrons' ultimate goal: to conquer death and create a legacy that will last forever. In this sense, the Necron machines are not just tools of war, they are symbols of the Necrons' unyielding drive to survive, to persist, and to reign. One of the most striking aspects of Necron technology is its alien nature. Unlike human inventions, which are often a reflection of our needs, desires, and imagination, the Necrons' machines are a product of a completely different mindset. There is no room for personal expression or innovation in their creations. Everything is driven by the need for power, control, and immortality. Their technology is not about creating new possibilities, but about preserving the old order, the old ways of thinking, and the ancient rituals of their race. In this sense, the Necrons' approach to technology is fundamentally different from humanity's rise. Where humans build to enhance life and experience, the Necrons build to preserve their existence, to freeze time itself, and to hold on to power in an ever-changing universe. The Necrons' technology, while awe-inspiring, is also a warning. It shows us the dangers of unchecked ambition, of pursuing power at any cost. In their quest to conquer death, the Necrons lost everything else: their souls, their humanity, and their connection to the living world around them. Their machines, while powerful, are hollow, devoid of the spark of life that makes creation meaningful. In many ways, their technology reflects the hollow nature of their existence, a stark reminder of the price paid for immortality. The Necrons' machines may be advanced, but they are also a chilling reminder of what can happen when a species becomes consumed by its own drive to survive. In their cold, calculating approach to technology, the Necrons sacrificed everything that made them human, creating machines that are powerful but devoid of purpose. Their story, and the story of their technology, is a cautionary tale for humanity, a reminder that the pursuit of immortality, no matter how advanced the technology, comes with a terrible cost. The Necrons, in their current form, are far removed from the way humans interact with the universe and the myriad races that inhabit it. Their relationship with other species in the galaxy is cold, calculating, and often devoid of the empathy or understanding that defines human interactions. But the question arises, were the Necrons, before their transformation into mechanical entities, driven by motivations that humans could understand? Or was their behavior, even in their earlier days, fundamentally alien, shaped by the influence of the Citan and their obsession with immortality? In their early days as the Necrontyr, their society was no stranger to conflict. They were a species constantly at war with their environment, their fragile bodies a constant reminder of their mortality. But even before their alliance with the Citan, they had an understanding of war and conquest. Like humanity, they fought for survival, for control over their dying world, and for a chance to escape the clutches of death. However, unlike humanity, their methods were deeply influenced by their fear of mortality. This fear often manifested in a ruthlessness that transcended the simple desire for territorial expansion. The Necrontyr were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting to preserve their very existence in a hostile universe that had no regard for their ambitions. When they made their pact with the Citan, everything changed. The Necrontyr were no longer just a people driven by fear. They became pawns in the grand designs of beings that were as ancient and unfathomable as the stars themselves. The Citan, with their godlike powers, offered the Necrontyr the one thing they could not achieve on their own: immortality. But the price of this gift was steep. The Necrontyr's behavior shifted from one of self-preservation to one of unquestioning servitude to the Citan. The transformation into the Necron race, driven by the biotransference process, further severed their ties to their former selves, turning them into beings of pure logic and cold calculation. They became something more than just conquerors. They became an unstoppable force that sought to dominate not just the galaxy, but existence itself. The Necrons' relationship with other races in the galaxy is built on this foundation of dominance and control. Unlike humanity, which has often sought to understand and coexist with other species, the Necrons see other races as either tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. Their motivations are driven by a singular desire: the preservation of their immortality and the expansion of their cold, unfeeling empire. To them, the other races are inconsequential, their lives meaningless in the grand scheme of the Necrons' eternal existence. But what about the Necrons' interactions with humanity? Here, things become more complex. Some fans argue that the Necrons' behavior toward humans is rooted in a recognition of shared ambition. Like humanity, the Necrons sought to overcome death and transcend the limitations of their existence. Their relationship with humanity, then, could be seen as one of twisted kinship, an acknowledgement that, in some ways, humans are not so different from the Necrontyr they once were. This theory suggests that the Necrons might view humanity not as an inferior species, but as a species that is on the verge of making the same mistakes they did. In this sense, the Necrons could be seen as a dark mirror to humanity, a reflection of what we could become if we allow our fear of death to consume us. However, others argue that the Necrons' view of humanity is far more dismissive and cold. The Necrons see humans not as equals, but as a fleeting, insignificant species, a nuisance to be eradicated when necessary. They have no real interest in humanity's potential or in our place in the galaxy. To the Necrons, humanity is just another species that stands in the way of their eternal reign. The fact that the Necrons have no interest in negotiation, diplomacy, or understanding makes them one of the most terrifying enemies in the galaxy. Their motivations are driven entirely by their own survival and the expansion of their empire, and they see little value in the lives of others. The Necrons' relationship with the other races of the galaxy, particularly the Eldar, Orcs, and Tyranids, reveals just how alien their behavior truly is. Take the Eldar, for instance. The Necrons' long history with the Eldar is a bitter one. Both races are ancient, both are incredibly powerful, and both have seen the rise and fall of empires across the galaxy. However, the Necrons and the Eldar have vastly different motivations. While the Eldar, despite their fall, still cling to the remnants of their ancient culture and seek to preserve what little they can of their civilization, the Necrons are entirely focused on power and domination. They see the Eldar not as rivals or adversaries, but as another obstacle to be eliminated. The Necrons have no desire to understand the Eldar's complex culture or the tragic history that led to their downfall. To the Necrons, the Eldar are simply another race to be wiped from existence, a step in the process of reclaiming the galaxy. The Orcs, on the other hand, present an entirely different challenge for the Necrons. Where the Necrons are cold, calculating, and meticulous, the Orcs are chaotic, unpredictable, and driven by a love for battle. But despite the Orcs' seemingly carefree nature, they are still a formidable force, one that the Necrons view with a mix of disdain and annoyance. The Necrons, being a race of order and precision, see the Orcs as a threat to their carefully laid plans. Orcs are unpredictable, and their love of war makes them a dangerous wild card in the Necrons' quest for galactic domination. However, unlike the Necrons' dealings with other races, their relationship with the Orcs is somewhat more complex. While the Necrons would never ally with the Orcs, there is an element of respect, albeit grudging, on both sides. The Necrons recognize the Orcs' strength and their potential to cause chaos, but they view them as an obstacle to be neutralized rather than a true enemy to be obliterated. Finally, the Tyranids represent a unique challenge for the Necrons. The Necrons, in many ways, are the antithesis of the Tyranids. The Tyranids are driven by an insatiable hunger, a desire to consume everything in their path and assimilate it into their ever-growing hive fleets. The Necrons, by contrast, seek to dominate and control, to impose their will on the galaxy rather than consume it. In this sense, the Tyranids are a direct challenge to the Necron way of life. They represent a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with, a cosmic hunger that will devour everything in its path. The Necrons view the Tyranids with a mixture of contempt and fear, as the Tyranids are the ultimate expression of entropy, a force that threatens to undo everything the Necrons have worked for. In the end, the Necrons' relationship with other races is a stark reflection of their own cold, unfeeling nature. They see the galaxy as a thing to be conquered, not understood. Their motivations are driven by a singular desire for immortality, and they view other species as either tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. Unlike humanity, which is often driven by curiosity, empathy, and the desire to build relationships, the Necrons are motivated by a need for control and survival. Their behavior is entirely alien, shaped by the C'tan and their own desire to transcend the limitations of death. To them, other races are inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, and their interactions with these races are always cold, calculating, and without empathy. As we conclude this journey into the question of whether the Necrons could be considered the first humans, it's impossible to ignore the complexities and contradictions that make this idea so fascinating. On the surface, the Necrons, with their cold, mechanical bodies and their ruthlessly efficient drive to dominate the galaxy, seem to be the antithesis of humanity. They have transcended the very essence of what it means to be alive, forsaking flesh and soul for the sake of immortality. But when we look deeper, at the origins of the Necrons, their cultural evolution, and their technological advancements, we begin to see echoes of humanity's own story. Could it be that, in the distant past, the Necrons were not so different from us? In their early days, the Necrons, or Necrontyr as they were once called, were a species not unlike humanity. They were driven by a desire for survival, for understanding the universe, and for conquering death itself. Like early human civilizations, they sought immortality, building vast empires and striving to transcend the limits of their bodies. The Necrontyr's obsession with escaping death mirrors humanity's own attempts to defeat mortality through science, medicine, and technology. The fear of death has always been a defining feature of our species, and it was the same for the Necrontyr, who saw their frailty as a curse to be overcome. But the Necrons' path diverged from humanity's in the most profound way possible. Whereas humans have always sought to overcome death with a balance of compassion, innovation, and moral consideration, the Necrons' pursuit of immortality led them down a darker road. The Necrons' eventual transformation into soulless machines, driven by the cold logic of survival, stripped them of everything that made them human. Their technology, their culture, and their very essence were consumed by their ambition to cheat death. The result was a species that, while initially driven by desires we can understand, became something entirely alien, creatures of pure will, devoid of empathy or connection to the living world. Despite this, it's hard to ignore the fact that, in their early days, the Necrons were not so different from humanity. They too sought knowledge, power, and immortality, and they too struggled against the inevitable. They were not the mindless, robotic entities they are now. They were a proud, intelligent species with ambition and dreams. They built cities, developed technologies, and created a culture that was once vibrant and full of promise. In many ways, the Necrons' rise to power mirrors humanity's own ascent, marked by the same struggles, the same desires, and the same drive to leave a lasting legacy. One could argue that, in their pursuit of immortality, the Necrons simply took the ambition that drives humanity to its logical extreme. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to transcend death, to conquer it entirely. But in doing so, they lost everything that made them truly alive. They shed their humanity in exchange for an existence that, while eternal, is devoid of purpose, emotion, or meaning. In this sense, the Necrons are a warning, a dark reflection of what could happen if humanity were to lose sight of the things that make us human in our relentless pursuit of immortality. The Necrons are not just a race of cold machines. They are the embodiment of a tragedy, a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition is allowed to consume a people. In exploring the idea that the Necrons could be considered the first humans, we find that there are more similarities between the two species than we might first realize. The Necrons' rise was driven by the same instincts that have shaped human civilization: survival, ambition, and the desire to transcend our limitations. But in the end, it was the Necrons' inability to accept the natural cycle of life and death that led to their fall. Unlike humanity, who has always struggled to find balance between life and death, the Necrons took their desire for immortality to an extreme, one that ultimately stripped them of everything that made them human. This brings us to a thought-provoking question. What if humanity's future holds the same fate as the Necrons? Could we too become consumed by our desire to conquer death? It's easy to see the Necrons as a cautionary tale, a reflection of the dangers that lie in our own obsession with immortality. But the truth is, humanity is already walking down a similar path, driven by advances in technology, medicine, and artificial intelligence. As we strive to overcome the limitations of our bodies and minds, we must ask ourselves, at what cost? If we lose sight of the things that make us human, our empathy, our compassion, our connection to life, will we become like the Necrons, trapped in an endless cycle of existence, but devoid of everything that gives our lives meaning? While the Necron story may seem alien and distant, it is one that resonates with humanity on a deep level. Their rise and fall are a reflection of the same impulses, fears, and desires that drive us today. The Necrons may have shed their humanity, but in doing so they serve as a reminder of what could happen if we allow our pursuit of immortality to overshadow the things that make life worth living. So, can the Necrons be considered the first humans? In a sense, perhaps they were. Not in the traditional biological sense, but in the way they too struggled against mortality, sought knowledge, and dreamed of greatness. Their story is a tragic one, but it is also a universal one that echoes through the ages, warning us of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the price of immortality. In the end, the Necrons are not so different from us after all. They are a reflection of what we could become if we let our desire for survival and dominance drive us to lose sight of what truly makes us human. As we reflect on the Necron story, we are left with a choice: to heed their warning or to continue down the path of ambition and survival, knowing that, just as they did, we too could lose everything that makes us who we are. What will we become in our quest to conquer the impossible? Will we learn from the Necrons' fall, or will we repeat their mistakes, trapped in a cycle of endless existence, devoid of meaning? Only time will tell.